Good evening, everyone. I think we're going to get started. Um, my name is Sean Quimby. I'm Associate Vice Provost and Director of the Kislak Center for Special Collections, Rare Books, and Manuscripts. And it's my pleasure to welcome you to the 2026 Rosenbach Lectures delivered this year by Professor Joan Judge of the University of York. Tonight, we'll hear the first of three lectures, with the second set for tomorrow and the final one on Thursday. Dating to 1931, the Rosenbachs are the longest continuing series of bibliographical lectureships in the United States. Here in Philadelphia, we like to celebrate firsts, so I'll add that the series is older even than Oxford's Lyell, Panizzi, and Mackenzie lectures, if not quite so old as Cambridge's Sanders Readership in Bibliography. Not surprisingly, if you compare the lists of past speakers for these distinguished lectures, you'll find that many of the same names appear, the bibliographical equivalent, I suppose, of batting for the cycle. But if my Googling skills are to be trusted, we're the first among our peers to land Professor Judge, and for that, I'm grateful to the Rosenbach Committee. The committee is chaired by Lynn Farrington, and includes the Morgan Library's Jesse Erickson, Penn faculty members Dev Patel, Megan Robb, Josh Teplitsky, and Whitney Tratine, as well as Penn PhD student Peter Diamond. That group has sought out eminent scholars whose work engages with material texts beyond the borders of Western Europe and North America. We'll spend the next few days in China. And that it's inclusive of diverse voices. Last year, for example, Kelly Wisecup spoke about indigenous ecologies of the book. So I'd like to thank our audience, both the in-person and Zoom audience, as well as the Seminar on Material Text regulars who are here, and those of you who might be newcomers to the book history scene at Penn, or even book history more broadly. Welcome. I hope that we manage to hook you over the next few days. Our program, like the Kislak Center itself, is robust and diverse. There is quite literally something for everyone here. So with that, I'll turn things over to Chloe Estep, Assistant Professor of Modern Chinese and Sinophone Literatures here at Penn. Professor Estep's research focuses on the ways in which so-called classical literature and art are reinterpreted and exploited in modern China. Her most recent publication is Retroactive Continuity, How Not to View a Scroll Painting in the 21st Century, published last year in the journal Comparative Literature. So, Professor Estep.
Thank you, Sean. Thank you everyone so much for being here. Welcome again to the 2026 Rosenbach Lectures in Bibliography. As I have already been introduced, I can tell you my name is Chloe Estep, and I'm an assistant professor in the Department of East Asian Languages and Civilizations here at Penn. It is my great honor to introduce tonight's speaker, Professor Joan Judge. Professor Judge is visiting Penn from York University's Department of History, where she is one of the foremost experts on print culture in modern China, a reputation established by her groundbreaking monograph, Print and Politics, Shibao and the Culture of Reform in Late Qing China. Judge's work brilliantly parses a complex historical moment when, in a paraphrase of Judge's own words, quote, fueled by the demise of Confucianism's cultural capital, the ascendance of new, foreign-derived learning, and accelerating commercialization in the treaty port city of Shanghai, this print culture traces the arc of some of the most significant political, scientific, and cultural trends of the era, end quote. Judge's subsequent monographs have further helped us to understand the role of print media in the production of ideas about gender in modern China. These include The Precious Raft of History, The Past, the West, and The Woman Question in China from 2008, and Republican Lens, Gender, Visuality, and Experience in the early Chinese periodical press from 2015. She has also co-edited several scholarly volumes, most recently, The Sinosphere and Beyond, Essays in Honor of Joshua Fogel from 2024. Professor Judge is the recipient of numerous international prizes, including a Guggenheim Fellowship awarded in 2021. Professor Judge's talk this evening is entitled Common Knowers, Readers, Books, and the Making of Vernacular Knowledge in China, toward an understanding of vernacular literacy. In the talk's advertisement, she provides, and we can see one of the images here, and another one I saw, she provides a striking image of men, women, and children at what appears to be a sidewalk book stand, crouched down, engrossed in reading what appear to be, some of which appear to be lianhuanhua, or illustrated books, sometimes translated as a kind of comic book. This reminded me of a strikingly similar image I imagine some of you may have seen this past fall when the Chinese-American artist Hong Liu's work was exhibited at our own Arthur Ross Gallery. In her 2013 multimedia piece, Street Library, Hong Liu paints a very similar scene, with mostly children clustered around a display of lianhuanhua, the actual three-dimensional books inserted into the painting, tempting us to pick them out and read them. The painting is also marked by Hong's characteristic oil drips, calling attention to the scene as already mediated by the artist, by time, and by memory. Like Hong, Professor Judge's work calls our attention to print media as form, as political event, as both private contemplation and public transformation. I look forward with great anticipation to learning more from tonight's talk. Please join me in welcoming Professor Judge.
Thank you so much, Chloe and Sean. So it is a tremendous honor to give a lecture in these series, as we've heard, which has such a storied history. A gift from the great bibliophile and book collector A.S. Rosenbach in 1928. While his vast interest in literature, in children's books, and Judaica did not focus on China, it actually did extend to China. The oldest printed book in the Rosenbach Museum and Library, which now houses and displays his collection, is a copy of the I Ching, or the Book of Changes, which dates to about the 12th century. And I'll refer briefly to that book on Thursday. It's also an honor to follow in this series scholars who have done so much to shape my own approach to book history, first and foremost, Professor Roger Chartier, also Carlo Ginzburg, Anthony Grafton, Anne Blair, and Robert Darnton, to name just a few. And finally, I want to thank Lynn Farrington for making the logistics so smooth in planning for today's beginning of this lecture series. What happened? Okay. There was a common reader in this cheap lithograph supplement to the complete compendium of myriad treasures, published from the mid-1890s. This particular reader was concerned with the problem of counterfeit currency. He had separated the section on strategies for assessing silver coins from the rest of the compilation, and had apparently repeatedly returned to it. The entry on coins is visibly more worn than other parts of the text. The circumspect trader or merchant was one of a growing demographic of common readers who turned to a proliferating number of how-to collections at the turn of the 20th century. As commoners and as readers, these common readers are historically elusive and poorly documented. They did not leave records of their reading. Many of them hardly wrote at all, with the possible exception of personal letters, household accounts, or business correspondence. When they appeared in the formal textual record, in newspaper commentary, social science surveys, or reports on mass education, they were objects of instruction or disdain rather than subjects of their own narratives. These are not, however, reasons to leave them out of history. To bring these common readers into history requires a method of approaching literacy that is attentive to their particular mode of literacy. This approach, which I refer to as a vernacular literacy approach, is praxis-oriented. It questions how written text fit into the practices of people's lives rather than the other way around. How, for example, a tattered supplement on foreign coins fit into the life of a hinterland trader. This approach from book to common reader starts with identifying the commoner's corpus of books, a corpus that has been poorly preserved and only scantily studied. It questions how readers acquired the ability to use these books and the routes through which the books made their way into readers' hands. In short, to bring common readers into history, we have to uncover the knowledge infrastructure that served them: the publishers, the schools, the bookstalls, the book networks. But first, what readers and what history? Who were these common readers, and into what history am I bringing them? I define common readers as individuals who read books not for a living, but in order to make a living and sustain their families. The circumstances for making and sustaining a living changed, and the need for how-to books increased over the course of the period I'm focusing on here, a period I refer to as the Long Republic. So the actual republic extended from 1912. This was after the 1911 revolution, which put an end to 2,000 years of dynastic rule, and it ended in 1949 with the communist takeover. But the Long Republic doesn't directly map onto those political dates. It's more of a cultural and epistemic formation. The Long Republic was bracketed on one end by commercial publishers' intensified efforts to broaden the sphere of what common readers needed to know in the volatile world of the mid-1890s. This was a world shaken by China's humiliating loss to Japan in the First Sino-Japanese War of 1894 to 1895, the culminating defeat in a series of defeats at the hands of foreign armies that had begun with the First Opium War in the mid-19th century. It was a world being reshaped by the erratic efforts of a faltering dynastic regime to rethink their prioritization of Confucian learning and ethics over foreign-derived new learning and technology, and their efforts to establish new forms of national governance by forging a new relationship with the people. So the Long Republic was bracketed on one end by the mid-1890s, with commercial publishers expanding the scope of what common readers needed to know to meet this complex moment. It was bracketed on the other end by the early 1950s, with the new communist regime absorbing all commercial publishers and consolidating the publishing industry in order to assert control over what commoners should know. In the intervening decades of the Long Republic that concern us here, a succession of those who I refer to as enlighteners, and this included reformers at the end of the last dynasty, Republican new cultural elites, nationalist officials, communist cadres. These enlighteners upheld a politics of tutelage and a new politically driven approach to literacy. Their dominant literacy approach was the medium and carrier of nationalist visions. Sanctioned by state officials, implemented in new-style government schools, its purpose was to create model readers, to cultivate citizenship, and to build a new China. This mission-driven approach stood in sharp contrast to the more circumstantially driven vernacular literacy approach. Fostered by daily life concerns, guided by commercially produced books, detached from official pedagogy, vernacular literacy enabled common readers to solve particular problems rather than address the problem of China. While model readers were to be made, common readers made themselves. Henry Ford captured the essence of the dominant transformative vision of the model reader in a conversation with James Yan, an enlightener par excellence and founder of a US-influenced Chinese mass education movement. Ford told Yan, "You will go about the mass education of people the way I go about the mass production of cars." Zhang Taiyan, one of the few intellectuals of the period to challenge key aspects of the dominant literacy paradigm, captured something of the spirit of the underdetermined formation of the common reader. "The individual is real," Zhang asserted. "The collective is the illusory." Various versions of this illusory collective governed the Enlighteners' obsession with literacy. It was an obsession that grew out of the millennia-long literati preoccupation with book learning as the singular route to bureaucratic advancement and social prestige in China. It was reinforced by the Enlighteners' acceptance of the 19th century literacy myth, the myth that literacy held the key to social and economic progress. Buying into this myth led these Enlighteners to add China's putatively abysmal national literacy rates to the list of its avowed deficiencies vis-a-vis foreign countries. It's an obsession that scholars have shared as they have vigorously debated the question of just how many Chinese could read. These scholars have parsed and disputed, cited, and challenged the disparate and problematic existing figures we have for literacy for this period. These figures are problematic in terms of metrics. Extant literacy surveys have variously defined literacy in often highly idiosyncratic ways, as the ability, for example, to read a 600-word, 600-character questionnaire, to sign a contract, or to craft a verse. Figures that are also problematic in terms of geography, either regionally patchy or nationally motivated to justify various tutelary projects, and therefore to occlude reports of what seem to have been exceptionally high literacy rates in key urban areas. Figures that are further problematic in terms of quantification of the threshold for literacy. Estimates range from several hundred characters to 3,000, without sufficiently taking into account the coherence of a set of several hundred or thousand characters and their relevance to a specific reader's most pressing task. A vernacular literacy approach puts these various problematic literacy metrics aside. It seeks an historical understanding of common readers as knowers rather than numbers. It begins with the vestiges of practices that were afforded by the common reader's informal knowledge infrastructure. The shadow informal infrastructure addressed the needs of commoners, which the state infrastructures erected by a succession of weak regimes in the Long Republic could not. It implicitly countered the politics of tutelage, which these regimes strove to advance, with a politics of accommodation. A politics that met commoners where they were, rather than dictated where they should be, that engaged commoners as knowers rather than as a malleable mass. This infrastructure included the publishers who produced how-to materials attuned to commoners' immediate needs. It included the independent or family private schools, the Seshu, that offered them accessible education. It included the street-side bookstalls that served as their public library. And it included a piecemeal book network that delivered books into the hands of those living in the furthest reaches of the nation. This alternate infrastructure is not systematically documented in archives and library collections. We have at best disparate data on commoner knowledge culture in the Long Republic, whether in terms of print runs, of daily use publications, whether in terms of rates of literacy, as I just mentioned, in terms of numbers of these independent schools, locations of bookstalls, or logistics of book distribution. My prime source space for documenting common readers and the infrastructure they relied on consists of a corpus of close to 500 how-to books, compendia, manuals, and recipe collections, that I've gathered from unofficial collections, secondhand bookstores, and second-tier university and major libraries in China, Japan, Taiwan, Europe, and North America. I read these works in conjunction with a handful of rare extant book catalogs and a broad range of government, archival, periodical, and fiction materials. Commoner knowledge culture cannot be located in any one of these bodies of sources. Rather, it is refracted through them in the worlds they inhabited, the advice they imparted, the spaces they depicted, and the lived experience they evoked. The central pillar of the infrastructure was the publishers of the books that commoners on at home or in the classroom, that stocked the shelves of street-side bookstalls, and that traveled from metropolis to market town to rural village. These publishers were small to mid-size commercial book companies that had often started out as lithographic publishers when that technology was first introduced into China in the late 19th century. I refer to these commercial publishers and often to the ethos that they carried as minjian, a term that literally means among the people, and that is variously translated as grassroots, popular, or folk. What is of relevance here is that minjian was the term that contemporary commentators often used when referring to these very book companies. These commentators used minjian, as I do, not to distinguish these publishers from government publishers. This is usually the opposite of minjian. It's the official, the guanfang, but to distinguish them from mainstream industrial publishers. These mainstream publishers served as proxies of successive governments and purveyors of the politics of tutelage. They produced official textbooks and cultural heritage collectania. The minjian publishers, while understudied and little understood, nonetheless produced up to 10 times as many books as mainstream publishers in the Long Republic, and for as little as 1/10 the price. So to reiterate, the market share of these books was up to 10 times the market share of more elite materials. Among this vast inventory of minjian works, how-to guides, my focus here, were arguably the genre that common readers most widely consulted because they were the most immediately useful. They included daily use compendia, medical recipe collections, treasuries of techniques. While these were not the first how-to books in Chinese publishing history by any means, they marked an important turning point in that history. They conveyed new forms of knowledge, and they addressed their commoner audience with unprecedented directness. The circumspect trader who we opened with, the one who was worried about counterfeit coins, used an expanded edition of a genre of compendium that dated to the 16th century, the complete compendium of myriad treasures, which I will refer to in my talk as myriad treasures. The information he relied on to assess whether or not a coin was counterfeit was not included in the main body of the compendium, however, but in one of its supplements. Over the course of the 400-year history of the genre, compilers had repeatedly added and deleted material from within the core sections of the compendia. In 1894, for the first time in this history, they started to append a series of supplements to the main body of the text. And this in many ways marks the beginning of what I call the Long Republic. These publishers effectively acknowledged that the existing knowledge structure could no longer hold, that the world of and around the common reader had changed. They added 4 supplements in 1894, including the supplement on coins that I opened with, 2 more in 1906, and further minor additions after the 1911 revolution. And these texts continued to be printed with their supplements up through the late 1920s. In addition to information on foreign coins, the supplements included material on foreign flags, foreign health tips, together with local and global techniques for managing a range of pressing daily matters, from opium addiction to cholera, from plant cultivation to life in a treaty port city. The high number of extant editions of these expanded compendia, which have not, I reiterate, been preserved in major collections, suggests the plethora of readers who use them. Well over 20 slightly varied editions were published between 1894 and at least 1928. The purpose of the myriad treasures had always been to democratize knowledge. This is reflected in an alternate title for the genre, literally to liberate readers from the need to ask others for assistance. This democratization and a back scratcher has the same, it's a buchoren, the back scratcher. So this term can be used in those different ways. This democratization intensified with the publication of supplemented editions from the mid-1890s, and more so again with the publication of new genres of daily use texts that were successors to the myriad treasures from the turn of the 20th century. The proliferating number and variety of these new style how-to books over the course of the Long Republic indicates the rising importance of common readers as both consumers of commercial publications and consequential social agents. Again, precise numbers elude us. According to the highest estimate, some 200 million books were produced in the Republican period, a critical mass of them in the 1930s. That's when there was really intensive advances in publishing. And this estimate does not include Minjian books, so the numbers could be significantly higher. But again, they're quite fuzzy. For the first time in Chinese history, authors, editors, and publishers of these practical media works abandoned what had been a centuries-long conceit that these kinds of books targeted all four groups of society: the literati elite, farmers, artisans, and merchants. Instead, they openly addressed a blanket demographic of common readers, who they referred to as ordinary people, 一般人士, or members of commoner society, 普通社会, among numerous other formulations. Minjian compilers were also increasingly sensitive to their prospective readers' literacy limitations. They explicitly assured readers that their books would provide practical, usable information rather than arcane academic knowledge. By the 1920s, they emphasized legibility and not just practicality. This book is for the use of ordinary society, the author of the introduction to the Treasury for a Myriad of Daily Matters asserted in 1929. It makes every effort to use clear and obvious language and does not esteem that which is lofty and profound. All who have a slight knowledge of characters can read it. There were several different routes through which common readers could have acquired a slight knowledge of characters in this period. Where and how they learned to read would have depended on a complex of factors: when they came of school age, their family's social status, and their geographic location in both the country and in the urban hierarchy. While they had often received some degree of primary instruction, they were not destined for higher education. Their literacy trajectories generally evaded the institutions of dominant literacy. They round past, if sometimes through, the system of primary and middle schools that was repeatedly revised by successive late imperial, early Republican, warlord, and nationalist governments, always with an eye to foreign models of education. They most often began not in these globally attuned government schools, but in an alternate complex of community-attuned independent schools. There's evidence that these schools, which have generally been neglected or disparaged in the historical and scholarly record, served up to 3 times as many students as government institutions in some parts of the country in certain periods. The education they offered, which was repeatedly updated over the course of the period despite critiques to the contrary, was primarily at the elementary level. For the not insignificant number of graduates, both male and female, who wanted to continue their education, government middle schools were the only option, but not a very viable one. Entrance was extremely competitive. By the early 1920s, 3 or 4 times as many students took the entrance exam to get into middle school than were admitted. And at the same time, the education was subpar. It offered students little preparation for practical life and productive work. I argue that middle school aspirants, middle school graduates, and middle school dropouts constituted a critical mass of the growing ranks of common readers in the Long Republic. Having attained more than a slight knowledge of characters in the primary and possibly secondary classroom, they continued their education on the job, as apprentices, as workers, as low-level functionaries, and caregivers. They also continued to develop their reading skills on the streets at the street-side bookstalls. Xu Xu, a theoretician and founder of government libraries designed to educate the masses in the 1930s, lamented that common readers would rather pay to read, to rent, or to purchase a book at a bookstall than to consult a book for free in an official library. He observed, and I quote, "Shanghai small bookstalls are repositories of knowledge for the factory workers and shop apprentices who are among the great majority of the masses in the city. These bookstalls are libraries for the masses, the prime reading site for the masses, and the principal source of reading material for the masses." They were also, to an extent that neither Xu nor his fellow enlighteners fully appreciated, sites of an easy sociability that encouraged reader engagement. Neighborhood institutions, bookstalls grew organically out of and catered to the needs of their immediate local communities. They offered customers the opportunity to peruse a book sitting, standing, or leaning, to take in a snippet of information or the chapter of a story on the fly, to jostle and linger with other customers, or to rent a book and move on. The stalls stood in sharp contrast to Enlightenment institutions, which were enclosed, sparse, rule-bound, and designed to create responsible, hygienic, and silent model readers. These institutions alienated and intimidated those whom the bookstalls, as Xu Xu observed, so successfully drew in. While Shanghai housed the densest and the most varied array of bookstalls, the street-side stall was a feature of all Chinese cities and provincial towns and many of its remote villages. These city, towns, and villages were connected to a national Minjian book network that enabled cheap print to flow from lithographic and letterpress factories in Shanghai to the hinterland via a grid of regional bookstores and marketing nodes. This network was an assemblage of old bookselling practices and new technologies, just as the books that traveled along it were often assemblages of long-standing and newly imported knowledge. Book peddlers still catered to the most distant of rural customers, but sophisticated postal and railway systems did more of the transporting over the course of the period. Advertising also took diverse forms. Crude signboards on the street continued to alert readers to the latest illustrated version of current events or a trusted collection of medical prescriptions. At the same time, a variety of new forms of postal advertising, such as targeted mailings of sample pages, informed customers in the provinces of the most recent publications. The better off and better educated of common readers living outside of urban centers might have used the sophisticated Minjian mail order system to request a book that had come to their attention via the post. The less well-off most likely would have taken whatever the local peddler had to offer that was of some interest. Reformers and social science researchers who sketched the social parameters of literacy in the Long Republic loosely divided these better and less well-off common readers into 3 ranks. The upper ranks were comprised of merchants, in small or mid-sized businesses, office employees in foreign firms, independent school teachers, and middle school students. With the exception of students, these individuals also had the greatest buying power. They would have earned over 40 yuan, or I'll call them dollars, a month, which would have enabled them to purchase more expensive Minjian editions that were still often, as I said before, a tenth the price of editions put out by industrial publishers. For example, a pristine edition of a 2-volume Treasury of Techniques with a list price of $1.60. The lowest ranks included individuals who had only a smattering of knowledge and encompassed the least literate factory workers, domestics, manual laborers, and rickshaw pullers. Earning less than $10 a month, they would have only been able to afford the cheapest books, small font editions costing as little as 20 cents, or the highly discounted 10-cent editions, which exploded in the 1930s. It was the critical middle mass that constituted the largest sector of common readers, males and females who lived in both cities and towns and were often clustered in rural urban communities on the outskirts of major municipalities. They included rural urban readers whom booksellers derided as country bumpkins, but who bought books nonetheless, and lower-level urbanites who were reputed to be among the most avid consumers of common books. Many of these individuals worked at occupations that their forebears had toiled at for centuries, in horticulture, in commerce, in household management. But many also moved into new occupations at the lower and middle ranks of the industries and institutions that opened up from the late 19th century and developed exponentially from the 19-teens, as China underwent its first sustained wave of industrialization. They worked at arsenals along the coast, in firecracker and silk reeling factories crowding the larger cities, in the lucrative shipbuilding industry, and in trading houses and shops that extended commerce from the treaty ports to the hinterland. They were employed in the lower reaches of government, administrative, postal, rail, and educational institutions, and they also encompassed some of the more literate manual laborers, including rickshaw pullers who worked the streets of major cities. Earning between 15 and 40 yuan a month, these readers could just afford to live in Shanghai, the priciest city in the period, where living expenses of a single skilled worker have been estimated at close to $20 per month in the 1920s. An expanded edition of the Myriad Treasures, priced at 80 cents for 6 volumes, would have been just within their budget. It also would have been in line with their pragmatic literacy needs. The few farmers, workers, and merchants whose concerns were recorded in this period confirmed their need for practical information that would enable them to excel at their occupations and improve their livelihood by mastering techniques for calculating the months of the newly introduced solar calendar, teaching them how to hold a calligraphy brush, how to repair a kerosene lamp, how to treat a childhood illness, how to graft a plant, or how to recognize a counterfeit coin. When a group of rural dwellers in the relatively prosperous coastal province of Jiangsu were asked why they wanted to be literate in the early 1930s, 92% emphasized concrete practical reasons. Literacy would enable them to keep accounts, to write and read letters, to avoid being cheated, to improve their planting skills or their business skills, to get rich, to write and read social documents such as invitations, to orient themselves on the road. A mere handful cited vaguely intellectual pursuits. Only 3% said they wanted to be literate so they could read books, slightly less than 4% so they could read newspapers. Adult students in the communist stronghold of Yan'an in the early 1940s were similarly task-focused. They were initially disinterested in political literacy classes, but became engaged when instructors revised the content to include practical information on calculating taxes, creating production plans, or organizing cooperatives. Practical and problem-based, commoner literacy was also dynamic. Scholars have noted that rural graduates of formal schools often lost their literacy abilities if they had no opportunity to use them. The reverse was also true, however. Those for whom literacy was a means to social betterment rather than a curricular exercise would have been motivated to continue developing these skills. Whether postal couriers striving to become postal employees, young women aspiring to be typists in foreign-run companies, or farmers intent on improving crop yields. When these individuals turned to books, they read them consultatively rather than contemplatively, discontinuously rather than comprehensively, in pursuit of practical autonomy rather than intellectual fulfillment. They also read actively and selectively, sifting, reordering, and appropriating, poaching, and bricoling in their own restless acts of reassembling. These restless acts are visible in the rare but invaluable traces that bring us closest to the hand of the reader and the preoccupations that drove the act of common reading. Check marks indicate recipes that they found useful. Additions, omissions, or corrections merge their knowledge with the knowledge printed in the text. Subtitles penned onto the front page of a fascicle revealed the owner's personalized summary of its contents. Hand-copied sections of how-to texts, this is an opium cure that somebody copied out in full, reveal the kinds of information individual readers deemed personally or socially useful. Penned or penciled in commentary confirmed the effectiveness of particular recipes. And here again, it's an opium recipe, a very simple recipe. You just have to eat an egg every day for X amount of days. And here somebody wrote in, I tried for 20 years to get off opium. My wife left me. I lost my home. I lost everything. Finally, a friend recommended this egg cure, and it worked. Sometimes they even added new tips to the ones that were recorded in a collection of common knowledge for the household. Finally, the wear and tear evident in certain sections of a work remind us that there were common readers in these texts and that there are challenges and rewards in the quest to find them. My quest to find these common readers begins with the content of Minjian publications and extends to an array of disparate qualitative and quantitative sources, as I mentioned before, including social science surveys, announcements in book catalogs, narrative advertisements in newspapers, faits divers in newspapers, contemporary observations, sketchy statistical data. Taken together, these various sources suggest who may have had the ambition, the ability, and the means to make themselves as common readers. And I will give a few examples here. An official working in the Hanyang Railway Office in landlocked Hubei province in central China in the mid-1890s was keen to get his hands on a recent edition of the Myriad Treasures. He was among a group of semi-professionals from throughout China whose requests to a publisher for a copy of the compendium were recorded in a series of advertisements. We were talking earlier about how important advertisements are in the newspaper Shenbao in March of 1895. So there was a series with individuals with various kinds of occupations, including this railway worker. The authenticity of these requests is, of course, questionable. This particular individual may not have existed, but the kinds of individuals depicted in the advertisements reflect the profile of readers the publisher hoped to attract. The numbers of common readers employed as railway staff increased along with new opportunities for primary school education and the ongoing extension of the miles of railway track over the following decades. The hierarchy of railway workers also became increasingly complex over the course of this period. By the late 1920s, the railway industry employed personnel at 48 different ranks, with corresponding salaries that range from $25 to $800 a month, putting them, this particular railway worker, well within reach of the myriad treasures that he was seeking. A woman from Baoding, a prefectural city in northern Hebei province, made herself as a common reader through what we could think of as male-adjacent reading. She first taught herself basic literacy using the calligraphy copybooks and primers that her brothers had discarded after using them at an independent school. She continued to study grammar and vocabulary by attempting to read books that interested her, such as the 18th century novel of manners, Dream of the Red Chamber. She went on to learn on the job, mastering the abacus and studying arithmetic after she married and had to keep household accounts. She deepened her reading skills as she supervised her son's education, memorizing the same 3,000 characters she chose for him to learn from a primer on the 13 classics. She continued to study alongside him when he was an elementary student and to learn as she eventually became a teacher and then a factory manager herself. Apprentice shop clerks made themselves as common readers on the job. They relied on their own wits, the book market, and the informal instruction they received on the shop floor rather than on the formal school system. These junior shopkeepers often came from lower middle-class families, which, given the rising cost of living, of rice, and of rent, could only afford to educate them through the upper-level elementary degree. Upon graduation at approximately age 15, they started what were generally 3-year apprenticeships. Minjian daily use works had provided informal instruction for aspiring shop clerks and merchants from the beginning of the Long Republic. From the mid-1890s, compilers had added excerpts from an early 19th century merchant manual to the third supplement to the Myriad Treasures. From the 1920s, Minjian presses began to publish increasingly specialized business manuals, which not only taught commercial skills but outlined literacy programs. One explicitly instructed junior shop clerks to practice their calligraphy in the morning, composition during the day, and calculation with the abacus and a pen in the evening. The manuals also advanced one of the most important critical forms of specialized commercial literacy, knowledge of the material qualities of authentic and counterfeit silver coins, which I opened with. This was the subject of that first supplement that I introduced, and it remained a topic of ongoing emphasis in all merchant manuals and many daily use compendia over the following decades. An apprentice mailman who was hired by the Anqing post office in the eastern province of Anhui in 1921 described his employment as the beginning of his mechanical life. Together with other low-level workers, couriers, and mail coolies, he was indeed like a cog in the machine of the vast postal bureaucracy. The post office employed more workers than any other government organ in the Republic. At its fullest capacity, approximately 40,000 postal staff, working in some 17,000 offices, serviced a network of 400,000 miles of mail. By 1921, when the Anqing mailman entered his local post office, staff were stratified to include white-collar employees, public service staff, and manual laborers. And this hierarchy became increasingly complex over the following decades. Grades of literacy varied with ranks, but all who worked for the post office were required to have some knowledge of reading and writing. Even the rural couriers, who were at the lowest end of the hierarchy, were recruited on the basis of their literacy skills. A farmer from near the city of Kaifeng, an erstwhile capital in China's Hunan province, was fortunate to live in a rural-urban area, an area classified as rural, but in close proximity to an urban center. Literacy levels were significantly higher in such areas than they were in strictly rural parts of the country. Documented incidents of booksellers duping rural residents provide indirect evidence of just how willing these rural common readers were to get their hands on the books they needed. Several accounts of efforts to swindle readers outside of major urban centers surfaced in the 1930s. One alerted rural readers to a scheme by which entities that advertised in post office catalogs or in the periodical press used fake shop names. Customers, so these poor, rural, anxious readers who ordered and sent money for the books, never heard back from the publisher. Price gouging was another way unscrupulous booksellers cheated rural readers. In 1934, investigators of commoner book culture in the Kaifeng Experimental Education District discovered that bookstall owners offered a fixed discount to their savvier urban customers and raised the prices for farmers who purchased books to take them back to the countryside. One local bookstall owner admitted that bilking the rural customers was the only way he and other booksellers could survive. Again, evidence that there was a critical mass of these rural customers. The most common primary occupation for both rural and urban women in the Long Republic remained that of housewife. Just as their male counterparts would have had to continue developing their literacy skills on the job, women were faced with often unrecognized literacy demands as household managers. When the library reformer Xu Shu conducted his survey of Shanghai bookstalls in 1933, his findings challenged the assumption that ordinary women were not readers. The survey indicated that women in Shanghai, particularly younger housewives, prostitutes, and unmarried women, rented books in great numbers. In 1935, a Shanghai committee of the nationalist government also found that there were slightly more literate women than men in certain age groups in the city, 13 to 19 years of age and 30 to 39. Nationalist government promoters of mass education in the 1930s found that women in the countryside were also eager readers. While these rural women were reluctant to visit institutions outside the home to go and borrow a book, they were avid consumers of books that small itinerant libraries circulated from one household to another on a monthly or a bi-monthly basis. Independent schools increasingly accommodated female students over the course of the Long Republic. As war conditions necessitated greater female involvement both in and outside the home from 1940, independent schools in the area surrounding Chengdu, the capital of the southwestern province of Sichuan, responded by expanding the opportunities for female education. In one of the districts of Chengdu County, for example, there were 102 girls among 720 students. Male workers were particularly proficient at making themselves as common readers. Their numbers had mounted with the development of industry in China from the 1910s, situating them among the fastest growing ranks of common readers in the period. Widely recorded observations in the 1930s noted that factory workers constituted a significant portion of common readers and bookstall customers. Studies from the early PRC, the early People's Republic of China, confirm how successful some of these workers had been in advancing their own literacy. A survey of Shanghai workers published in the Liberation Daily Newspaper Company in 1950 indicated that 8.5% of this population could read without ever having been to school. Authorities responsible for officially run literacy programs under the new communist regime in 1951 found that the basic literacy materials they had prepared were far too rudimentary for Shanghai workers. With only a minimal education, these workers had acquired the skills necessary to keep accounts and write letters. Male factory workers and female factory managers, railway officers and farmers, shop apprentices and housewives faced daunting challenges on their path to literacy in the Long Republic. From an inadequate official education system to an unsupported independent school system, from long working hours to salaries that made the purchase of reading materials difficult, if not impossible. At the same time, the more fortunate and resourceful among them found ways to acquire the competencies they needed to solve everyday problems and fulfill their occupational aspirations. They built on skills they had begun to develop in village school classrooms. They endured demanding apprenticeships, and they read over the shoulders of brothers, sons, and male cousins. They also sought out, perused, and when possible, purchased the growing number of houses on bookstall shelves, from local peddlers, and in branch bookstores. These Minjian works did much to advance the Common Readers Project of making themselves. They also serve as a point of departure for our own daunting task of identifying who China's common readers may have been, what they needed to know, and how they came to know it at a time of profound epistemic, technological, political, and cultural flux. A vernacular literacy approach follows the publishers of these Minjian works in trying to meet common readers where they were in this moment by uncovering the informal infrastructure they relied on, deciphering their physical traces, understanding the concerns that might have led them to seek guidance in a how-to book. It reminds us that there were once common readers in these rustic, torn, and marked up books, and that the rewards far outweigh the challenges in the quest to find them. Thank you.
We can take questions now if there are any questions.
Thank you so much for the talk. You have pointed out that the Long Republic does not map obviously precisely to the political reality. What can you tell us about government control and censorship during that period?
There were efforts to censor, but the government was too weak. So, and there was, a copyright regime. There were laws on the books, things that were very difficult to enforce. So the state really did not have much ability to control. This will change radically after 1949, and I go up to 1954 because it takes them sort of those 4 years before, they absolutely consolidate the publishing industry. So all of these small Minjian publishers are brought together and, disaggregated. They disaggregated the distribution part from the public. So there, it's a very different story. But at this time, very little successful government censorship.
How stable is the text of Myriad Treasures? We see these supplements. Is everybody getting the same supplement, or are different booksellers supplementing with different things?
Thank you. Quite stable. So stable from the 16th century when they were first created. Over time, there'd be additions. For example, there's a section on officialdom, and that would change over time. Sometimes the section on geography, they would change things up a bit. And actually, after 1911, after the revolution, there's a change to the interior. They have a section on cutting off the queue. They have a section on the new president. But the supplements are a whole new thing. But the changes themselves are stable. So it's not like whatever edition you pick up is going to have, different new material inside. And these supplements were basically fundamentally replicated. The very last one, there were shifts. Some of them had more information on like railway lines, etc. But like the one on coins, stable, flags. So quite a stable text. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Fascinating. I was struck by, and I don't know how much this is your own selection, but if I were comparing your corpus to the kind of studies of popular reading in Europe earlier, it's the period I'm familiar with, there certainly are how-to books that are important in that domain, but a lot of more attention focused on romance, fiction, ballads, these kind of texts. So is that a real difference, do you think, or is it a kind of accidental difference because you happen to talk about these?
Thanks. That's a great question. It's an intentional difference. So absolutely, there was all kinds of novels. These same publishers had a huge list of what they called vernacular novels. These are novels that had been published earlier, but in a more vernacular language. Then there was new literature, but these publishers didn't produce like what was the cutting edge sort of European attuned literature, but what they called, new style old literature, which was, the same kind of romantic tropes, but, slightly modern. So there was a tremendous amount of that material out there. And I don't want to convey the sense that these readers only read these how-to books, but I was interested in ideas of knowledge, how knowledge was changing. So what I really did in this book is I looked at 4 different, knowledge-related topics: opium addiction, cholera, learning about new techniques like electricity, and horticulture plants. So that was my focus. So I talk about how, the bookstalls also sold, these illustrated serial books. Ballads were, of course, very important to this demographic because so much was chanted. So there was a certain amount of that in the book, but I make pretty clear, or in the project this comes out of, but I make pretty clear that my focus was on this realm of knowledge.
Thank you, Professor, for the education. If I'm not mistaken, you said a very you said a very a mouthful statement that please allow me to read in your conclusion. Please allow me to read on it. You said that the Communist Party found out that the materials that they were producing to the commoner in Shanghai was actually too rudimentary for them. The common people were actually very sophisticated. So if I'm not mistaken, my take-home message from that statement. So maybe the Chinese experience was actually they were natural egalitarian, and they found that the communist revolution was just to let them breathe and allow their natural egalitarianism. So that tells us a lot about the Chinese Communist Party today. The president of China was here in the United States, and he said, we promised our people that if they work hard, right, they will prosper and they will have a good life. So maybe the communist China is not really communist.
Oh, it's certainly not communist. Yeah, but I don't quite see. Anyway, that's more a comment than a question. Yeah.
Thank you so much for this talk. With the concern about the counterfeit coins, you have obviously foreign artifacts that are entering China, and people are worrying about them. You're covering a period when, of course, there was a lot of foreign contention over China. I know very little about Chinese history, obviously, but somewhere in there is the Japanese, if you will, colonization of large parts of China. There's civil war. It seemed what was missing from your talk was propaganda literature, political literature that's trying to sway opinions. Does that enter the corpus at that time?
It certainly does, in terms of what the industrial publishers are producing and what the government is pushing. So there is that whole realm of print, but that's not what these publishers are focusing on. Even in, they're all greatly disrupted by the Japanese invasion in 1931. The whole publishing was decimated in Shanghai, and then worse again in 1937. But that actually did good things for some of these publishers. They recovered quickly because they produced cheaply this thing called the 10-cent book, which these Minjian publishers produced. It really took off in the 1930s. So it's not like the Japanese invasion, which really did hurt the industrial publishers, at least for a couple of years. It almost helped these kinds of publishers. But their work was never heavy-handed political. That was not their role. And I'm not saying that wasn't in the ether. I'm not saying it wasn't out there. I'm not saying that these same common readers would have been subjected to some of that. But that's not, that wasn't, the focus of these publishers. So you see it indirectly in things like, I talk about, somebody grafting plants in the late 1940s, and his land had just been decimated by years of war, et cetera. But it's foremost isn't the political. It's definitely in the background. It's shaping things, but it's sort of how do we get through this? Sure.
Is it not odd that this kind of publication would not have been instrumentalized by political forces that are trying to sway?
They were but produced by other publishers.
Yeah.
So the government would have nothing to do with these publishers, considered this stuff to be dross and garbage, and so this wasn't their instrument. They had their instruments. Those were the industrial publishers who were, putting out reams and reams of stuff. But they wouldn't have turned. And, quite often you would have like the elite publishers looking to what these mean jam publishers were doing and saying, we got to pick up on what they're doing because they're reaching so many more people, and they would try and sort of ape what they were doing. But they didn't try to use them politically.
Thank you.
Thank you for this. Actually, my question picks up on the last comment you made about the, sort of picking up on trying to identify what it was that was so appealing about these, this particular type of publication. Is there something prior to this period that they knew in terms of, this now I use the term literary texture loosely, but what is it about sort of tutelage and education that was available before literacy? It's not just learning characters. So what about that did they tap into to be able to, is there something that we can reconstruct as far as like a pre-literate literacy that the vernacular communities would have some access to in whatever context? Because obviously it's also something that they found to make uniform somehow across all of these different vernacular audiences. So is that something available to us is the question.
Yeah, there were many different ways that pre-literate audiences were reached. From the government point of view, they had these, lectures that the local Confucian official would deliver. And, that would be instructing people in how to comport themselves. And then more on the level of these kinds of materials, there was popular drama. And, that taught people sort of the grassroots kind of morality and who you should consider to be good and who bad, et cetera. So, yes, there were many forms. And the ballads, which continued to be produced, through this period, and more textualized than they had been in the past. That was another way that messages were conveyed about, culture and history and et cetera.
Is there something in the texture of the characters and the language and how they actually were converting that pre-literate of what was available before literacy into the supplements that allowed that continuity? I'm trying to see if there was some way that they grafted that continuity of what they were already was available to them that really made this popular.
Well, I think one thing was, sort of the notion of orality was kind of built into some of these texts. And quite often, this is the primers that one would use at the independent schools. They were chanted. That was how people learned. And that was another reason why common readers were so turned off by public libraries. You're supposed to go in and be silent. That's not the way you read. So I think, that is sort of one carryover. I'm sure there are many others. But the notion of, conveying, I'm trying to think about more how they conveyed practical knowledge. I think also sort of through rhyme and verse. Those were the mnemonics. There were mnemonics for conveying how to memorize a recipe so that, you might not be able to read the recipe, but a woman would have heard it many times and be able to reproduce it in that way. So I'd say, yeah, orality, verse, those kinds of things carry over. But this is a much more textualized narrative form of knowledge than what they had previously.
I've got a couple of questions from Zoom. Thank you for the lecture. Can you speak to any external cultural or political forces, if any, on the domestic consumption of these readers? I think they're talking about things outside of China.
So if they read things that came from outside?
Well, it's
external forces.
It's unclear. It sounded like it had to do with, external things that would be have an impact on
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and I'll talk about this tomorrow when I talk about vernacular knowledge, that one of the components of what I call vernacular knowledge was really translated Western biomedical or scientific knowledge, which sort of gets translated into a more legible idiom for these people in these books. Yeah.
Another question, you mentioned geographic disparities in literacy rates and Shanghai as a particularly literate area. Were there any regions that stuck out in your research as having lower rates of documented vernacular literacy?
Well, Shanghai, the cities were all much more literate. And when I talked about geographically patchy, I was really meaning in terms of literacy surveys that have been done. But clearly, it's the Jiangnan region around Shanghai, which was always known to be the most literate, and then Northwest, least so. Yeah, so there are definitely parts of the country that are considered and have traditionally, historically been sort of the centers of culture and literacy.
And one more here. Thank you so much for your talk. Could you speak a little bit about your research process? You mentioned that these common readers are not centrally gathered. Were there any particular unique challenges you faced during this research or any interesting archival experiences that you could share?
Yeah, the most interesting was a friend of mine who teaches at Beijing University, at Peking University to be known as, knew that I was trying to collect these kinds of books. And she told me that there was a trove of them in a collection outside of Beijing. And we all know, all of us who do China, something that's an online platform called Kongfu It's like an online platform where you can buy old books. But this is a physical site of that online presence. And very few people know that it exists. It actually does have a public-facing library. This is how it somehow got money from the government to get the piece of land it has, which is quite far out of Beijing, but is still considered Beijing. And anyway, she told me that she knew they had some of these materials, these daily use compendia I was interested in. So I told her to ask the owner if I could come. He said no. She asked again, no, asked again. He said she can come if she gives me $10,000. And then I said, and he said, they're not cataloged. These aren't, we don't have them organized. And I said, tell him that maybe I can get a grant at some point and help him organize and catalog them. So finally he said yes, but it's sort of a typical Chinese thing. It takes 3 no's before. So anyway, I got there and it was just, I mean, manna from heaven. They were all in cupboards and just thrown in, ripped, torn, but with the handwriting. And so I had an absolute heyday and took multiple pictures, and sort of the dragon lady who was supposed to oversee me would come in and say, not too many pictures, Professor. And I said, no, not too many. But anyway, I got a trove, and then went back the next year and took out my phone and they said, no. So I couldn't, I had to, at that point, request, tell them exactly what I wanted and they would copy for me. But I got enough on that first long trip to, get a sense of titles, get a sense of, print runs, different versions, and in which sort of compendia, they had multiple copies of. So that was really, I mean, the heart of this project.
Thank you. Great photographs, by the way. My question, I think, touches on some of the topics that may have sort of come up earlier, and it's a very broad one. So this sort of practical knowledge, to me, I'm suggest that there's some degree of like social mobility, and I'm wondering if you can sort of speak to the sort of question of social mobility, the sort of period before and the period after. And I wonder, like the person who asked about sort of external influences, if sort of Western notions of sort of self-improvement and mobility are sort of being imported in some way. Thanks.
Thank you. They definitely are. Whether or not they really reach this stratum, not so sure. But the elite stratum definitely there was a very famous Japanese book, The Self Smiles. Yeah, Samuel Smiles, yes. But here, less sort of, even self-reflection on that kind of thing. But clearly social mobility was the reason that these people were, trying to get their sons a good apprenticeship, and the son was trying to, diligently, make it from the apprentice clerk to the whatever. So literacy was definitely a ticket. And like the woman I gave the example of who, sort of by the end, this illiterate woman was actually a factory manager. So it was a ticket for these people, but without, I think, a lot of the sort of, discursive underpinnings of, we must improve ourselves. I think it was just, the process of trying to make it for yourself and make it for your family, and eventually getting somewhere. Yes.
A quick comment just about how it seems really reminiscent of the situation in India, where you both have sort of the middle class, Samuel Smiles, et cetera, genre and variants, and then this explosion of pamphlets that are, frequently at railway depot stalls with everything under the sun from, teach yourself radio acting, how to build your own aerodrome. But some of these things seem to have escaped the subcontinent and percolated into the diaspora. And I was wondering whether that's something, or is that limited to sort of the commercial publishers? Because there's some examples from India of self-help books specifically for women reaching readers in the Caribbean, in Southeast Asia, associated with the indentured labor diaspora. And I wondered whether there's anything analogous in the world of Chinese print.
Interesting question. I don't know. I mean, I haven't come across, copies that were held by diaspora communities, but I imagine they would have been. That would be really interesting to follow up. Thank you.
Hi, thank you so much. I was struck by how many of your materials referenced classical learning, not necessarily in the sense of like Confucian learning, but in terms of classical language. And I think I was curious about the proportion of like classical language texts that were published by Indian publishers, and how that might complicate our understanding of literacy in this period when, we know the vernacular was very much an elite project, right? And it's quite fascinating that it seems like a lot of these vernacular literary materials had a lot to do with classical language. And then another sort of inverse question, which is with something like the Myriad Treasures, were there ways in which you noticed that the printing practices were updating, through things like punctuation or layout, were sort of modernizing that text, even if it was sort of maintaining the language? Thank you.
Thanks, Chloe. Great questions. Yeah, so these texts were written in what we could think of as, Chen Wenyan, so simplified classical Chinese. Quite often you'd even have a text that would be written in two registers, like the prefaces to sections might be in sort of difficult, elusive classical Chinese, but then the how-to parts that are telling you how to do the technique would be very simple classical Chinese. But absolutely not, this Chloe refers to, this move for what was called the vernacular language around, 1919, 1920 in China. And that was really a Europeanized grammar that was brought in. It was much more foreign to these readers than this simplified classical. So, as I said, they were trained at these independent schools. They would have started with the Confucian primers, and it was much easier for them to learn a simple form of the classical language than what was supposed to be the vernacular. And then the second question, yeah, you see when you go from the Myriad Treasures to later daily use texts, so the ones that I see sort of following on from there, increasingly you get more punctuation. You go from 3 registered texts to maybe 2 or 1. Different ways of indicating a different section. And I go into a whole thing about that, the typography that really makes it much easier for the reader to, see what's a section and a subsection. And yeah, so all of that, is something that builds on the content in the Myriad Treasures with new sort of forms of layout and presentation of language.
I have one quick question which struck me. I was kind of curious about how you constructed some of these examples around people specific. I mean, where in the archives are you finding this kind of information that allows you to make these constructions?
Yeah, and I'll talk about that a bit more tomorrow. I actually decided, since I started this project wanting to get to know common readers and realizing I was not finding them, that I had to do a certain amount of work myself and create composites of common readers. The ones I presented today, though, all came out of there's some actual textual basis for that individual. So the railway worker, it was an ad. This person wrote in, I want this book. There's a collection of letter writing guides. So a book that was created to teach people how to write letters, and many of those letters had these kinds of stories in them. So the woman who becomes a factory manager, and then some of them I sort of put together from the daily use texts themselves, that would have, for example, the instructions: a merchant should do X in the morning, an apprentice should do this in the morning, this in the afternoon, this in the evening. So some of them come right out of these sort of letter examples, which are themselves sort of fictional, and some of them are me cobbling a number of sources together. So it was the funnest part of the project. It's probably the riskiest part of the project, but I just felt, and I read about other scholars who worked on common readers in early modern Europe, and they said you hit a wall at a certain point. You've got these books, they had readers. You can't find the readers. Use your imagination. So
Thank you so much for a wonderful first lecture. We look forward to tomorrow night.
thank you for wonderful questions.